Alright, welcome to the 10th video in this series on orchestration. In the last video, we were introduced to the most common instruments found in the woodwind section, including their ranges, tone colors, and the three subsections that each instrument is divided into for practical orchestrating purposes. In this video, we will cover some specific strategies to help you when writing for the woodwind section. We'll cover the most common uses for these instruments, specific considerations to be made when writing for them, and even a few basic things to help keep in mind when notating your music. Now, if you've been following this series closely, you may have noticed that I didn't include a video for the most common playing techniques for woodwinds. Honestly, that was because many of the techniques that we covered for the brass instruments are the same ones that we can find for the woodwinds, with the obvious exceptions being that neither cuivre nor mutes are techniques that you'll typically find in the woodwind section. However, a few quick things that I would like to mention are that glissandi and flutter tongue are both technically possible on woodwind instruments, but they're not found nearly as often as they are with brass instruments. Flutter tongue tends to become more difficult with each reed that an instrument uses, and true glissandi tend to be very difficult for most woodwinds, other than the clarinets. Finally, whenever writing for either woodwinds or brass, please keep in mind that both sections require air to play. So make sure to provide moments in your music where your players can breathe as a common courtesy. The higher and louder the parts being played, the more air is needed, so the more frequently these breaks should be. Other than that, however, please consult the brass video if you want a refresher on some basic techniques that you can use for your woodwinds. So with that, let's get started. Now, the primary roles of the woodwind section all tend to take advantage of the wide range of tone colors available to these instruments. You can typically find them playing roles that add color and life to music. One common approach is to use scale runs and trills to provide a little ear candy to your music. After the melody and harmony have been firmly written, you can emphasize important moments by placing these elements in the background of your music. A scale run is exactly what it sounds like. The instrument moves quickly up or down a scale in the key of your music. These can be done by a single voice, in octaves, in chords, however you'd like. The main idea here is to just give a boost to the energy level of your music by adding another moving part. Trills are also very commonly used to add additional energy and color to sustained chords or notes in your music. They can even be performed for their own sake, to provide said color. The important thing to keep in mind for either of these situations is that they are both very much background material, and should be written carefully to make sure that they don't distract from your foreground. In terms of harmonic roles, just like the brass and strings, the woodwinds can very easily provide the harmonic foundation and bed, aka the bass line and the chords. However, unlike the brass and string sections, woodwinds can't really be relied on to contain enough power to fill these roles alone during large climactic moments. They're much better suited for more intimate and quieter moments when the harmony is less likely to get buried underneath a much more powerful melody or countermelody. If the orchestration is on the larger and more powerful side, then the woodwinds are much better suited to double up with other instruments from different sections to lend their tone colors to the harmony, melody, countermelody, etc. Or to just simply play a different role in your music altogether. If you're going to use the woodwinds to play your bass line and harmony, there are a few different chord configurations that you can consider that will actually have a big impact on the type of sound you're creating. The first type, juxtaposition, is when different instruments perform separate parts of the chord. For example, in an E minor chord, the oboes perform a G5 and an E5, while the clarinets perform a B5 and an E4. The second type, interlocking, also known as crossing, is when different instruments perform parts of the chord that overlap each other, pitch-wise. For example, the oboes performing a G5 and a B5, while the clarinets perform an E5 and E4. The third type, enclosure, is when one instrument's pitch range encompasses another, or where one instrument sandwiches the other. For example, the clarinets performing a G5 and E4, while the oboes perform an E5 and B5. The fourth and final type is overlap, in which different instruments actually share some of the same notes in the same chord. For example, the flutes performing the G5 and E5, while the oboes perform an E5 and B5, and the clarinets perform a B5 and E4. Now, the reason for each of these approaches is to help blend the sound of your instruments together to differing degrees. This is especially important for the woodwinds since they have so many different tone colors, but it can be used for any sections of the orchestra. In general, interlocking and overlapping tend to help different sounds blend together into a newer sound, while juxtaposition, and especially enclosure, tend to help each instrument in the chord keep its own sonic identity. At any point that you're looking to create a particularly blended or perhaps a particularly heterogenic sound, there are two additional guidelines that you can consider. The first is whether or not all instruments are performing notes within registers of similar power to the others. For example, if 3 instruments are all performing in their strongest register, then the sound will blend much better. But if one instrument is performing a pitch in a stronger register for itself than the other instruments are, then that instrument's sound will stick out as the most recognizable in your chord. They won't blend as well. The second guideline is that all instruments belonging to the same subsection, so flutes, single reeds, double reeds, should be performing notes that are within consonant intervals of the notes being performed by the other instruments of their own subsection. This is especially important for the double reeds. The reason being that if any one subsection has more dissonance in it than the others, then it will stick out as the most dominant tone color in your chord, since that dissonance will force it to stick out more so than any other subsection. If you keep these ideas in mind as you orchestrate your music, you can more fluently control the type of sound that you're getting for your music. Aside from performing chord progressions and bass lines, the woodwinds also provide an excellent option for harmonic arpeggiation. This is where the instruments outline the chord progression by performing a repetitive rhythmic figure that sticks to the notes found in the chords underneath. Now, this approach isn't enough to provide a solid foundation by itself in your more climactic moments. However, it can bring an entirely new feel to moments in your music by energizing them with a little more movement and ear candy. Honestly, in my opinion, this is one of my top go-to options when orchestrating larger statements in my music. Now, aside from harmonic roles, woodwinds are prime options for performing your melodic material. Their wide variety of tone colors make them excellent choices to double with other instruments or to even perform solo. However, despite being one of their greatest strengths, the wide variety of tone colors also brings with it additional things that you need to consider when selecting which woodwind to perform your melodies solo. In general, the first thing you need to consider when selecting a woodwind to perform a solo is which instruments are actually physically capable of performing the material. What is the range of the passage, and which instruments can actually hit each of the notes necessary? Next up, you want to narrow it down further by looking at which of the remaining instruments can perform the solo in a range that's powerful enough to maintain the foreground amidst whatever other instruments are performing at the same time. Finally, after having narrowed it down sufficiently, you simply want to consider which of your remaining options, if you have more than one, will have the type of tone color you think will benefit your solo the most. That being said, of the many different instruments in the woodwind section, not all of them are really suited for solo statements in the first place. The flutes are an excellent choice, but only in their low and mid register. The upper registers tend to be too shrill to be of any use in these situations, while the middle register is best suited for sweet, lyrical, and strong melodies. The low register will really only be of any use for intimate and quiet moments. But in these instances, you'll be very hard-pressed to find a better option when you're looking for a very rich and haunting sound. Oboes are another excellent choice. However, their optimal range for solos tends to be even more restricted than the range we discussed for performing melodies together. In the instance of a solo, you typically want to keep as much as possible to the octave of A5 to A6. This is to help make sure that you make the most of the characteristically emotional and expressive sound of the instrument. When you're looking for the same type of sound but you want to perform lower than this range, then the English horn makes for an excellent substitute, this time with an optimal range of D4 to D5. Now, the bassoon will work best in its upper register, basically anywhere from A4 and above, since this is typically where it has the most lyrical control. However, keep in mind that this is also a weak register for the instrument, so it's going to require very careful attention to differentiating it from the background. Finally, the clarinet is possibly one of our most versatile options, with the ability to perform any solo with an incredible range of emotion. But the instrument typically works best in its lower and middle registers. Like the flute, the highest register doesn't tend to be of much use for these particular situations. Just keep in mind that the lower in the clarinet's range you move, the less carry power it will have, and the more attention you will need to pay to your differentiation. Now, the very last thing I would like to touch on in this video is just a little bit of notation procedure that should be useful for everyone, even if you don't plan on writing down your own music. As we've touched upon in these past two videos, it's very typical for woodwind players to perform multiple instruments. For example, one of the clarinet players may double on the bass clarinet, or an oboe player may double on the English horn. In these instances, these multi-instrumentalists are given their own staves in the full score. The very first page should list all of the instruments that they are responsible for, with a small asterisk next to the instrument that they will be starting the piece with. The following pages will only list the instrument most recently used by the performer. Now, where this comes into play for all of you strictly digital composers is that you need to provide time in your music for these performers to switch the instruments. Courtesy dictates that you should provide at least 3 full measures of rest for the performer to put down their first instrument, pick up their second one, and to blow some warm air into it before they start playing. This is very important for making your music sound as realistic as possible, because it's just not possible for a single player to perform one instrument for a measure and then instantly switch instruments for the very next measure. When notating a change, you simply write the name of the instrument they should switch to over the very first blank measure after finishing a passage on the instrument they most recently used. Then, if you want them to switch again, simply follow the same practice to keep things running smoothly. And with that, we've reached the end of yet another video in this orchestration series. If you found it helpful, please like and subscribe to my channel, and please share it with anyone you think might find it useful as well. In our next video, we're going to shift gears again and start focusing on some additional orchestrating topics, like picking instruments to double together, and why transposing is even a thing in the first place. Once we're done with those, we'll get back on track by focusing on writing for the percussion section. But until then, thank you so very much for your continued support. Keep working hard, keep learning new things, and as always, keep writing new music.